Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 16th installment of Science Stories. This speaker series highlights the work of science writers, illustrators, filmmakers, and other creatives who bring science to life through storytelling. It's brought to you by the McMaster Alumni Association and the School of Interdisciplinary Science. I'm Katie Moyse, Associate Professor in the school and your host for tonight's event. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker, Yasmin Tayag. Yasmin is a staff writer at The Atlantic, covering health, science, and the future of food. Previously, she was a science editor at 10 and Inverse. Her writing has been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Guardian, Vox, and Bon Appetit. And she's been a guest on Science Friday, NPR, South by Southwest, and other shows and events. Raised in Scarborough, Yasmin received her honors Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto. She then moved to New York City to pursue a master's in biology from New York University, where, in what seems like a different life, she spent a year in the lab extracting eggs and sperm from sea squirts. I'd like to hear more about that. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have some great questions from students on how you got into science journalism. We'll save those for after your talk. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie, and to the rest of the team at Mac. Thank you for having me. It feels really nice to be back in Canada. I'm actually in Scarborough right now visiting my parents, and it's great to be here speaking with a Canadian audience. I miss home very, very much. Um, and I'm so excited to tell you about the work I've been doing on the future of food. Okay, so the name of my talk is What's for Dinner? Reporting from the front lines of the future of food. I'll tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing over the years. I've been a journalist since about 2015, and I began as a science writer at the website Inverse. And I still very much think of myself as a science journalist, but over the years, my interest in health, in climate change, in biology, it all kind of tumbled together. And I realized that the easiest way to write about all of those subjects is through food because it really bridges all of the disciplines. And one of my favorite things about writing about food is that everybody is interested. Um, I'm sure those of you who are science journalists know that sometimes you have audience members or you're speaking to people who just feel like they don't understand science. But for me, food has been a really good way of explaining to people that, yes, you do encounter science every day. It's in the food that we're eating. Um, but in particular, I'm interested in the future of food. That is largely because I am a cook. I cook a lot at home. I used to run a Filipino food pop-up in New York City. I can tell you more about that later. But the truth is, I spend a lot of my time at the grocery store buying food, trying to budget, wondering what to feed my family that's both healthy and affordable and doable, all within a day's work. And that's got me thinking a lot about, are we going to be able to eat in the ways that we eat forever? And that's what my talk today is about. So usually when I tell people I talk about the future of food, I report on this. What they normally think of is the stuff you see on the screen. They say crickets. They say lab-grown meat. They say space-age vertical farming technology. Um, and I can tell you in my reporting, all of those things definitely come up all the time. At a previous job, when I was at Inverse, we were really big on talking about insects as food. And I even brought in a cricket flour cake to my office without telling my colleagues. And I had them taste that versus another banana bread loaf that I'd brought in, and nobody could tell the difference. So, thinking about these things affords opportunities for stuff like this. I'll talk to you a little bit about lab-grown meat. I'll talk to you more about, I will touch on different ways of farming. And so certainly the future of food can be very sci-fi, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. in my reporting, I found that the future of food also involves thinking about all these things you see here. And so, transportation, transporting our food, crop failures. Here is a photo that haunts me, just empty grocery shelves, something that I remember encountering during the early days of the pandemic. I walked into a grocery store and there were no types of pasta left except lasagna. For some reason, nobody wanted lasagna, and that was the only thing left. Um, on the bottom left here, we have farming, pretty traditional types of farming. We have food pantries. That's part of the future of food. And we also have in this bottom right, that's a photo of a new variety of crop, bred to taste different than previous ones. And so, the future of food can mean all of these things, and it is kind of all encompassing. But one thing I try to keep in mind is the question, what future are we preparing for? And, what are we really worried about? So when we think about the future food and we imagine bugs and alternative meat and vertical farms, what are those things supposed to address? Um, and there are, of course, many, many answers, but I find it helpful to try to distill them into two main questions. That's what are we going to eat and who's going to get to eat it? So to go back to bugs and lab-grown meat, we're thinking about these things because we're worried about not having enough protein for everybody. Um, and that in turn is because we're worried about the climate impact of the way we produce the protein that we do have, which is like beef and chicken, which we know isn't awesome for the climate. um, so, we're proposing bugs and lab grown meat as a potential solution to that issue. Another problem, the supply chain. We're constantly afraid that the world is going to run out of food. I'm sure you've heard this claim a lot. The research suggests that's not actually true. Um, we will probably have enough food worldwide, but the problem is that we're not very good at distributing it um, equally, and a lot of people have less access to it than others. So we'll talk about that later. Um, crop failures are a big thing I hear about a lot. And of course, this largely comes back to climate change. It's going to have a huge impact on our crops. I don't think there's any denying that. Um, farmers are going to need to have support to deal with this future. And to me, what's really important about the future of our crops is that we as consumers are so used to eating the same things all the time. We rely on basics such as bread and rice and um, I don't know, Doritos maybe. All of these things kind of come down to the same types of food, corn and wheat and grain. And if the way that we grow these crops is no longer sustainable, then what are we going to do? Um, I mentioned the grocery shortages. I think about a lot about grocery stores. I spent a lot of time in the grocery store. And to me, that's such an important interface for us as consumers to really come face to face with the way that our food supply is changing. Um, and the changes can be pretty subtle. And I think it's important to learn to recognize what's going on there. And so I'll come back to that as well. Um, quickly, farming, that's going to be a huge part of the future of food, in part because the ways that we currently farm, with a heavy reliance on industrial farming, it's not considered sustainable. It's not great for the climate. It's um, not great it's not easy to distribute. And so there are a lot of folks in the future food world thinking about better ways to farm. And sometimes that means going back to old ways of farming. Food banks, to me, the fact that so many people an increasing number of people are reliant on food banks or are food insecure really underscores this idea that the future of food is going to require us thinking about who's going to get to eat and who's going to get to eat well. For some people, the future of food might not be that different because they can afford to buy the goods that they're used to. But for others, even now, as the prices of foods rise, um, it's already becoming harder to maintain the same diets you've always had. And finally, we have embracing old and new species. As the climate changes, one thing we're going to have to think about is, as I said, what kind of crops we can grow. And this leads us to an uncomfortable question for some people. What about GMOs? A lot of people have strong negative feelings about them. And I think as we think about the future, it's going to be worth probing the reasons why. Okay, so that's a big overview of the things I think about on a daily basis. It's lots of stuff. But um, what I want to talk to you about is very broadly how I think about answering the question, what is the future of food going to be? So I think the core question at first is always, what are we going to eat? Is the food we rely on now going to run out? Um, well, we can take a look at what's happening to the food that we're already eating. In many cases, there are food shortages, and some very basic foods are in short supply. And that can show up for us in many different ways. It can show up as very, very simply the crops or animal numbers are dwindling. It can show up in the grocery store where suddenly you don't see them anymore. And that can be due to, people hoarding, or issues with the supply chain. Maybe the trucks just don't make it out as far as your store. Most often, we see food shortages in the form of rising prices. And another is related way that we see the effects of short supply is shrinkflation. If any of you have noticed that your bags of chips they have like a little more air in them, or your carton of orange juice is suddenly now it's been replaced with a bottle that holds slightly less orange juice, but the price stays the same. These all can be indicators that the base ingredient of that product is in short supply. So some of the examples that I've encountered in my work are oranges. You may or may not have noticed this. Um, the orange industry for several years now has been in a pretty devastating decline. Florida, which has once been known for its abundant orange groves, their industry has pretty much been decimated, and so has that of Brazil, our other big orange producer. And it's all coming down to this disease called citrus greening that nobody knows how to eradicate. And it's really been driving up the prices of orange juice, forcing some manufacturers to even think about um, switching to different citrus. So there's a possibility that we'll all be drinking mandarin juice, or um, maybe blends are becoming common too. So your orange juice might become orange, strawberry, banana. Um, Another example, olive oil. Um, Olive oil is so expensive, and it's because in the past few years there's been drought in the Mediterranean, and so the trees are bearing less fruit. Um, Similarly, sugar, peanuts, vanilla, all of these crops around the world are being hit by bad, unfavorable climate. And so far, the industries don't know how to recover from that. Uh, One that's not quite affected by climate, but related is eggs. I'm not quite sure what the situation was in Canada, but in the States, because of bird flu, there have been intermittent egg shortages in the past couple of years because when bird flu, which is spreading among our chicken farms and cow farms, when it hits a chicken farm, you have to cull all the chickens, and that means potentially, a million chickens who aren't going to be laying eggs for the next couple of months. And that produces a big dip in the supply, and then egg prices go up. So a lot of potentially scary shortages to come or already here. But one of my favorite shortage stories I've worked on in recent months is one about a cocoa shortage. I know, kind of scary. There is a global cocoa shortage, and it is threatening the chocolate that we love. But one reason I love this story is because it led me to some people who are thinking about pretty fascinating solutions. Okay, so there is a cocoa shortage. I came across this news in March, um, mostly through business news. Not something I typically follow, but I'm starting to pay more attention to. I read that cocoa prices in January were $4,000 a ton, and then they went to $10,000 a ton in just a few months. And I was like, what was up with that? Um, the short answer was that there is disease and bad weather in West Africa where like 90% of the world's cocoa is grown. But of course, it isn't that simple. And as I did more research into this world, I realized how complicated chocolate is. So, in addition to disease and bad weather, you also had cocoa farmers in West Africa who are living in absolute poverty and are terribly supported. There's sometimes illegal gold mining on those farms. There's child labor on those farms. And the farmers are getting older, and the younger generations of people living there don't want to be cocoa farmers because it's not a good job to have. But I also learned that so much of cocoa is due to um, forces well beyond the actual farm. I had to learn a lot about economics and futures trading and speculation, things that I could not possibly explain to you right now. But basically, it's that cocoa is traded as a global commodity, and the price reflects not only the actual supply, but the supply that investors think they'll have in the future. So when they are worried that there's going to be a shortage, a continuing shortage, which is the case now, the prices go up. And the other thing I learned is that the chocolate industry is super complicated. You have the raw cocoa grown at the farm level, um, but it doesn't magically become a Mars bar. It goes through processors and middlemen all the way up the chain, gaining value through that process until it finally reaches places like Cadbury and Hershey's, and that's where the huge amounts of profits are made. Anyway, what all of this is to say that this told me that the future of cocoa isn't just an issue of climate and disease, but also, farm labor, economics, corporations. And as I was writing this piece, told by my editor to keep it at 1,200 words and turn it around in 1 week, I was like, how am I going to distill all of this into something digestible for a lay audience? And of course, what I thought is um, I'm going to bring it back to what people see, which is chocolate bars. And sure enough, I found a lot of evidence that candy bars that we buy at the store, at Target, they are shrinking. They are becoming more expensive. They are starting to contain more fillers, such as peanuts and fruits and nuts or other nuts, so that um, the manufacturers don't have to spend as much money on cocoa. And the title of the article that I ended up writing at The Atlantic is Chocolate Might Never Be the Same, because we don't know what's going to happen to the cocoa supply. And if corporations can find that they're still able to sell chocolate with a little less actual cocoa, a little more peanut butter, if they find that they can uh, make do with chocolate substitutes, that might also change our chocolate for the long term. Um, so it's a pretty uncertain future for a food that we all know and love. One um, one path that this investigation led me down, though, was discovering that there are um, people envisioning a world in which the chocolates we know and love are not actually made with cocoa. And so that brings me to the world of cocoa-free chocolate, a real thing. These are companies who think that the future of chocolate doesn't actually need cocoa plants. Cocoa plants are, you know, they involve so much, cocoa farming involves so much exploitation and harmful practices. So why not just cut it out? And so there are companies um, that are trying to concoct cocoa-like substances out of plants. Um, and honestly are doing pretty good. I tried one chocolate bar from a company called Planet A that had zero cocoa in it. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed. It kind of tasted like Nutella, but not in a bad way. And I thought, if more of this means less, you know, terrible impacts on farmers and on the planet, maybe that won't be such a bad thing. I don't know. Um, so that leads me into one solution to food shortages that I like to think of as futuristic food. So this is kind of what I touched on in the beginning, really sci-fi, techie stuff. The broad way I think about these things, these foods, as well as nutrients and processes, is trying to find ways to enjoy the foods we love without any of the bad impacts. So, plant-based meat is supposed to be a way for us to enjoy meat-like food without having to grow meat. Vertical farming is a way to grow vegetables that doesn't require clearing huge tracts of land and using a lot of harmful fertilizers. Um, and I include functional foods, foods like powdered greens, protein powders, gut health drinks, things that you associate with wellness. I tend to include these in the category of futuristic foods, not because they exist to abate any particular negative impact, but because they envision a new way of ingesting food. Um, so here in the slide, I have a photo of a powdered green, which is, I suppose, being proposed as a way to get your veggies without having to eat salad. um, and on the left, I have a picture of what appears to be a regular BLT, but is actually um, plant-based bacon, plant-based bacon flavored with lab-grown bacon fat. I know that sounds insane. I'll start by saying that sandwich I showed you, as well as these meatballs, um, that you see here, they are made from plants, but the fat that they're flavored with came from real pig fat cells grown in a tank that pumped out fat and then was swirled into the plant-based mixture, with the intention of making the plant-based stuff taste good. Katie, I can see you laughing because it's so crazy. It is pretty crazy. And I'll say it was really good. The bacon, I couldn't tell the difference. I was shocked. Um, and so, why does this exist? As you've probably heard or experienced, plant-based meat, your Impossible Burgers, your Beyond Meats, they taste fine, um, but they're not amazing. They don't taste so much like meat that people are dying to go out and buy them. And they're also they're more expensive than regular meat. So this vision of replacing all of our meat with plant-based stuff isn't quite panning out. One Another solution that's been proposed to this need to replace traditional meat eating is lab-grown meat. So if you see on the right side of my slide, there's sort of a continuum of solutions that have been proposed with lab-grown meat as the final frontier. So lab-grown meat is when you take an animal muscle cell, say from a cow, and then you grow it in the lab so that it proliferates and in theory becomes a collection of cells that is like a chunk of meat. And all of this happens without having to grow the cow or kill the cow or, clear off all the land for the cow. This is a long way off. It's super expensive to do. Um, and one thing that's been really hard for companies trying to do this is that it's hard to get the structure right because, you know, a steak has a lot of components. It's not just mush. Um, so that brings us back to lab-grown fat, which is being seen as a bridge between plant-based meat and lab-grown meat. And the idea is that lab-grown fat is easier to grow because it doesn't have a structure like a steak. You can take the animal fat cells, multiply it in a big tank, and it comes out. One company told me that it comes out looking a lot like margarine, just blobs, which is fine because you're just going to mix it in with the plant-based meat, swirl it all together, and then serve it. And as a cook, I know that when you have a lot of fat in your food, that's what gives it flavor. And sure enough, it did work in this case. The plant-based meat tasted like bacon, and it was awesome. So, what all of this reporting taught me is that this solution assumes that we're not going to be able to give up meat. We're always going to look for the taste of meat, and that we're not going to change the way we already produce meat to become any better. Um, so, we have to come up with these technological ways to figure out how to have meat or at least satisfy that craving. Um, that's one way to look at solving our future of food problems. The other, and I'll go through this quickly because I know we're running out of time, is what I think of as past as future food. So another way to look at addressing our food shortages is to look to the past for ways in which people were uh, going about producing, cooking, eating food in a more sustainable way. And so the broad thinking in this case is that we used to be pretty good at feeding ourselves, but industrialization and globalization have made this unnecessarily complicated. Um, and this takes a sort of back to basics approach where we don't need technology to feed ourselves. We just need to get rid of our bad food practices. So some examples I have listed here are, community gardens, embracing whole foods as opposed to processed foods, which, helps people make more nutritious choices. Um, I'd be curious if anybody knows what the photo down here of this scary looking building is. This is the Svalbard Seed Vault. It is way up in the frozen wastelands of Norway. It is a repository of as many crop seeds, like all the seeds that are that can be collected are stored here for safekeeping in case someday, for some reason, our crops will fail or we'll need to come up with new crops. And this is a sort of library of all of the crops that have ever existed in our lifetimes. And so all of these interventions are, they are geared toward focusing on what we know best about food, which is like food grows on farms. They can be cultivated well. They can be cultivated sustainably if we do it right. Oh, this last photo, sorry, there's a picture of squash here. Um, this is meant to represent seasonal eating. And I like this example because it points out the role that we as consumers have to play when it comes to the future of food. We're so used to eating avocados all year round. But that's because there's a network of growers all over the world that ships avocados to us all the time. But we don't often think of the downsides of that. And so if all of the food, if all of our food comes to us in that way, where they have to be transported, grown at scale, grown as monocultures, required tons of like foreign labor, what's the cost of that? And how can that change if we become okay with eating what's available around us, like squash in Canada in the fall, as opposed to avocados all the time? Um, so I've written about this a lot, and I think one story that really captures this past as future food approach to thinking about this. The future is a story I wrote about farms growing, people beginning to farm in Alaska's melting permafrost. Like, let that sink in. It's like farming in Alaska because the interior of Alaska, which we think of usually as like a big frozen wasteland, because that's what it was, is now being opened up for farming. And I came across this bit of news that the Alaskan government was beginning to auction off huge parts of their interior for agriculture. And it's because the permafrost is starting to melt. And so this told me that like climate is changing our landscape, perhaps nowhere more dramatically as it is in Alaska. Um, and people are having to adapt with the changing landscape. And, my immediate impulse was, okay, this is bad, right? Like we shouldn't farm in Alaska's melting permafrost. That seems terrible. But again, it was more complicated than I anticipated because um, Alaska is often in shorts has often doesn't have a great supply of food. It obviously is not chock full of farmland, but it's also at the end of the supply chain. And so it's expensive to bring and grow food out there, much like I'm sure the territories and Nunavut here, the minute the supply chain breaks down, they're going to be the first to be affected. And so the repercussions this has on people's health, um, are issues such as malnutrition and obesity because the food that tends to accumulate on the grocery shelves there are canned foods, candies, processed foods that last a long time. So people in Alaska had already been thinking for a long time about how to become less dependent on the mainland for food. This naturally led them to think, what if we could have our own food sovereignty by having our own small farms? And so I learned that there are already farmers growing food in Alaska and quite well. Here in this slide, this is a screenshot of a FaceTime I did with a farmer in Alaska in the height of the growing season there. And she was like, look how big my crops are. The sun shines for like 20 hours here during the summer. So, you may not think food would grow well here in Alaska, but during the summer months, our cabbages are like as big as basketballs. And I saw them and I was blown away. And similarly, there are a lot of indigenous folks out there trying to restore old and come up with new ways of feeding themselves, hunting, fishing, but also growing in small greenhouses. So my big takeaway from this story was that there is a fork in the road for these people where they're asking themselves, how do we adapt to the way our landscape is changing? And on the one hand, they could say, we could continue to do what we are doing now, which is to open up big tracts of land for industrialized farming. Or, we can be more far-sighted and mindful about what's actually needed. In Alaska, they're asking themselves, if we're going to grow a lot of food here, who's it for? Is it for the locals? Because then you don't actually need that much food because there's not a lot of people there. But if it's going to go into the industrial food system, there's that is requires a different type of farming. Um, and these are the sorts of conundrums we're going to face as the world changes and we keep thinking about um, how we're going to grow food and who it's going to go to. Um, and so to sum up, in my reporting on the future of food, it all comes down to what are we going to eat? Who gets to eat it? We don't have a lot of answers. We can go the futuristic route. We can go the traditional, like looking backwards route. I think that as the world changes so rapidly and there's so much inequality, there's global tensions, I think we need every option we can get. Macro changes, micro changes, futuristic, history facing. Ultimately, I think the thing we all have to realize is that whatever we're doing now, the way we eat, the way we cook, the way we buy our foods, it's not going to last. It's going to change somehow. And we're going to have to be open to adapting, which I think we can do. Okay, that's all. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. That was wonderful. I love your stories. You are one of my favorite writers, and full disclosure, a dear friend as well. And this has been such a pleasure, getting to hear from you about these wonderful stories and sort of the process behind them. You mentioned, so we're now going to enter into the Q&A portion of the evening. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. If you'd like to submit a question now, just click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and submit there. We will get to as many as we can. You mentioned in the context of your cocoa story, sort of noticing in a business report that the cost of cocoa had more than doubled in a matter of months, and you said, "What's up with that?" Is that like where do story ideas come from? Can you tell us how you're finding them? Are there these moments of like, "What's going on there?" and just diving in? Is that how it typically happens?
Yeah, a lot of the time, I spend a lot of time reading food industry news, some pretty niche websites like a Food Dive, Agriculture Dive. There's a really good one called Food Navigator. Highly recommend. And it's all pretty nitty-gritty news about the costs of certain types of food rising or supplies going down. So that often, I'll follow certain trends, certain foods for a while, and then a story will come up. That's one way. Another way I come up with stories is, like I said, I'm at the grocery store a lot. And a lot of the times I'm just observing, prices, but also like the availability of certain kinds of food, certain food trends. One kind of shorter, funny story I wrote recently was I was at the grocery noticing all of these fruits that were not the color that I thought they were supposed to be, like white strawberries or like yellow kiwis. Um, what was the other one? I don't, all sorts of fruits that are just like pink pineapples. And the story I wrote was like, what's up with all these fruits? Why do they exist? Who's buying them? And it actually turned out to be a really interesting look at like um, the the sophistication of genetics, food genetics now. Um, and so yeah, I cull from the news as well as my own experience as an eater.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. And what is your favorite part of the storytelling process? Or you've been an editor as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the different parts of reporting on science, health, or the future of food, and like what do you love about each part, I guess?
Um, one thing I would say the part I love most is in the writing itself and finding ways to take all of these, pretty complicated themes and questions and finding ways to really connect with the reader. Like I often envision like my dad or you, Katie. I'm like, who's the person reading this and how do I make them care about this as much as I do? And the beauty of food writing is that I just get to write about food. It's like, think about how tasty your chocolate is or how many memories you have from Halloween trick-or-treating and think about that changing. I like to find ways to connect with people at that level because I think it's a good entryway into the the bigger picture of the foods that they eat. Um, of course, the reporting is often fun, especially when I get to try cool new foods um, and talk to scientists who are just so jazzed about the things they do. Like that food, the lab-grown fat producer I spoke to was just dying to tell me about how when he opens the valve to his fat tank, it comes out looking like yellow margarine. I was like, cool, that's awesome. So the many, there are obviously many aspects to the job, and there's really a lot of opportunities to interact with people with really interesting ideas.
That's awesome. That story is wild. So, plant-based meat, meat flavored with lab-grown meat derived fat. Is this technically vegetarian if there are no animals involved? Do we need a new label here?
I think we do. I mean, first of all, I think whatever that product is needs a name because you can't just call it plant-based meat with lab-grown fat. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
Yeah.
Um, but honestly, one of the most interesting things about this, like the alternative meat space, is the ongoing debates about like, is this vegetarian? Is it kosher? Is it halal? There are all these
Mm.
debates happening, and nobody is really sure. And so a lot of the questions are coming down to factors like, well, why are you vegetarian in the first place? Why do you want plant-based meat? Um, and I think I'm going to say that for now, something like that is still an animal product,
Mhm.
but that could change.
Okay. All right. We'll have to stay tuned. Um, you mentioned disease in crops. You mentioned disease in animals too, and how these things can shape our access to food, the cost of food. Can we talk about foodborne illness for a moment?
Oh, yes. Well, how fitting when I'm really happy to say that this panel has been going on for 45 minutes, and the food poisoning I was experiencing 3 hours ago has not yet reared its head again. So, yes,
Thank goodness.
foodborne illness, a real issue, one that we're seeing a lot of these days. Um, in the US, um, McDonald's got hit pretty hard, and I actually wrote about this. And, there are many reasons that um, outbreaks are becoming more common, and they're not necessarily due to a failure of like a lack of safety, but they could be. One factor that experts have pointed to is that after the pandemic, a lot of workers in food processing plants um, like quit. There's just not enough people. So the safety checks have sort of don't have the human power to keep up a certain level. Um, but for me, one of the big reasons I think we keep seeing these widespread foodborne illness outbreaks is because so much of our food is produced like in an industrial way. So it's produced centrally. In the McDonald's case, they traced back the E. coli outbreak to the onions, the raw slivered onions in the Big Macs, which were cut up at a different facility and then shipped to all of these different branches across different states. So all of those, any branch that was reliant on that particular distributor could potentially have E. coli. And this actually didn't only affect McDonald's. There were other fast food chains like Taco Bell that also got their onions from this one place. And so I think if this is how our food system is set up, where we get so much of our food from these centralized shipping points, and I think that really um, increases the opportunity for a lot of people to get sick at the same time.
Mhm. Okay. So an argument for shopping and eating local and
Yes.
yes, and
Yeah.
okay. And scary that some of those checks are not happening anymore. Foodborne illness is certainly on the rise and yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a great question about microplastics.
Oh
The
boy.
question is, how worried should we be, but also, are we made of them now because of how much of them we consume? So, I wonder if you can address microplastics and as well as just the future of food packaging more broadly.
Yeah. Um, so the short answer to that question is yeah, we're all made of microplastics now. I have one of my good friends wrote a piece recently for the New York Times about how microplastics have been found in male testicles because they're just in there now. And I think the same can probably be assumed of most other parts of our bodies. And the reason is it's getting into the food that we eat, the fish, the animals, through the packagings of our foods. Um, and it's kind of hard to escape at this point. So I think the strategy to address that now is not to I don't think you can just clear them out of your body or avoid them outright, but I think you can make some decisions that are um, going to reduce your exposure. So, don't microwave your food in plastic if you can help it, or put your water in a metal bottle. Um, sorry, Katie, what was the second part of the question?
Just the future of food packaging.
Oh, yeah. Um, it honestly shocks me how reliant we still are on on plastic um, to wrap veggies at the grocery. Like, why? Especially foods that have a peel. Like sometimes I'll see a banana wrapped in plastic. It doesn't make sense. Um, so, I think there are some efforts to come up with more sustainable ways of packaging food or just not packaging them at all. I think ideally we would all be shopping at farmers markets and just holding the food and putting it into our canvas tote bags. But, it's not as easy as just saying get rid of all the bags because we also have to think about what it's like for the farmers to pack these things, storing them, transporting them long term, long range, keeping them cold. Um, I can't say I know of an innovation that's going to change the world, but it does feel like we're ripe for for something new.
It's time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's time. We don't
Okay.
really need that stuff.
I agree. All right. I want to change gears slightly to talk a little bit about your career path. We have some great questions from probably students, I'm not sure, but folks that are interested in how you sort of made this switch from doing science, studying science, being in a lab, into the world of science communication. So I wonder if you can tell us more about that.
Sure. I'm always happy to tell this story because it's not very linear. Um, Having worked in science journalism for like a decade now, I've met a lot of people who, went to J school, or sorry, studied journalism in undergrad and then went to journalism school for their graduate programs, and their whole lives have sort of been geared toward this, whereas mine took kind of a more meandering path. Um, I was supposed to become a doctor, surprise, just like a lot of people. And then I ended up at NYU for initially I had applied there for grad school in um, what was it called? Biomedical journalism. They had like a special degree there. And I applied there and the journalism department rejected me. hmm but the biology department took me. So I ended up doing a master's degree in biology, studying sea squirts. And yes, so I had to extract their eggs and sperm and mix them together in a plate until they produced life. I know it was a lot of power, and I would study the embryos as they develop. Um, but by the time that finished, I decided that I wasn't going to go into medicine. And then I had this big question of what do I do with a master's degree in biology? Um, the one job I was able to get was as a copy editor at Nature journals. And so for a couple of years, I just edited the raw manuscripts about protein crystallography straight from the scientist to make them readable. It was incredibly boring, but I learned a lot about writing because copy editing is just like the craft of writing, and I learned so much there. Um, but truthfully, the way I got into journalism itself was that at that time, I was in my mid-20s. I was in New York. I was going to parties. I was meeting people like Katie. And when they asked me what I did, so I would kind of lie and say I was a writer. Like, oh, I'm a science writer. And until finally somebody believed me and offered me a job at a new startup called Inverse. Um, I had no experience really, and I was really, really bad at my job for like the first 2 years. Um, but just through sheer repetition, writing 2, 3 stories a day every day for like years, I got a little better at it. And then I moved up from there to being an editor and tried to learn every chance I could get, and eventually ended up at the Atlantic.
You are far too modest. You have certainly been a mentor to me. Okay, that's I think just acknowledging that career paths are very rarely linear, or as linear as, we might make it look on our CVs or so I think it's so nice for people to hear that we can try things and change our mind and change gears um and it's never too late to do these
Totally.
things.
And nothing's wasted either. Like
Yeah,
that biology degree, the C squirts, it's informative.
totally. No, we take things from all of this, whether it's just connections, skills, so many transferable skills. Nothing is wasted for sure. C squareds, that's amazing. So in terms of science communication, mis and disinformation is such a huge challenge right now. You mentioned GMOs and how people feel about GMOs, and that, GMOs might be an important part of the future of food. And so addressing how we feel about them and any concerns we have about them is going to be an important part of this behavior shift. How do you think about myths and disinformation in your work when you're looking for story ideas, when you're writing your stories, um, when you're looking at comments on your stories? I guess how does it play into your job?
Yeah, I think I'll say that like now more than ever, I think our job as science journalists is so important. And I think our job is to um, continue to uphold what is real science, what is really steeped in scientific reality and what is not. And I think my big worry is that line is constantly blurring for people. Um, and so in my own work, one of the ways in which this comes up a lot is when I see a piece of misinformation or disinformation floating around the internet, being repeated in the news. For example, I mean, lately, RFK Jr., the Trump's appointee to lead public health in America, has been saying a lot of negative things about fluoride in the water. And he's been saying it's bad, it lowers people's IQ. And, when I encounter news like this, what I have to think about is should this be addressed? Um, and if so, how do you do it so that you're not unnecessarily giving credence to an idea that shouldn't be circulated even more? And that there's always like a fine line there because sometimes it's pretty like sometimes it's pretty obvious that like this is cut and dry, just complete nonsense. Like this idea that 5G internet, is used to control us. Um, that's pretty easy to pick apart. But something like fluoride is actually really complicated. Yes, there's fluoride in our water. It's been great for a great public health intervention for a long time. Are there some studies that show a correlation with lowered IQ? Yes, but those are really complicated studies, and you would have to really get into the nitty-gritty of them. And so it's an ongoing I think science journalists have to be very mindful about the way they present their arguments and to be very judicious in what they choose to amplify and consider the dangers of potentially amplifying something that should just be ignored and pushed aside.
Mhm.
But this is coming up a lot these days, and I think we all have to really, make sure we know what's real,
Mhm.
as I think
Mhm.
this is going to become a lot more confusing in the years to come.
Yeah. So you spoke to sort of your role as a science journalist and uh I wonder if you can speak to that role of upholding what's real and some of the maybe challenges that you encounter in doing that um through commenters, through interacting on social media. How do you feel about this now and leading into the next 4 years?
Um, I have a personal rule, which is don't interact with
Okay.
social media. I feel like it never really goes anywhere. And I don't think it's the right venue for civil debate.
Hmm.
If people want to have like a real discussion with me, I always encourage them to like email me, then we can have a real talk. But I don't know, I'm very wary of these forums where nobody's really out there to have a reasoned conversation, and it's all about dunking on each other. And I
Hmm.
don't want to participate in that. It doesn't seem like a good use of my time.
Yeah.
But, something I also have to remind myself of is that, there are people who are so deeply anti-science and they have these crazy views. And my first reaction is to get mad and to so sort of dismiss them. But I have to remind myself like that these are people who care about their safety and their safety of their families and loved ones, and they're just trying to do what's best for them. And that, reminding myself of that gives me pause and it forces me to think about how best to reach people like that.
Hmm.
Is it going to be by blasting them with facts? Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it comes down to understanding what they're afraid of or what they're worried about, and then talking to them about that in a more civil way.
Hmm. Hmm. Well said. We are at 8 o'clock. So I would just like to thank you so much, Yaz, for sharing your evening with us during a bout of food poisoning, no less. This has been such a pleasure. We're so grateful. And thank you to everyone for attending, for joining us on a Tuesday night. I hope you'll join us for our next one, which will be coming up in the new year. And stay tuned for an announcement too about a webinar coming up tomorrow night as well. Thank you so much, Yaz. Take
Thank
care.
you, Katie. Thanks, everyone. And if any of you have questions, please feel free to email me. You can find me online.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.